Taking steps to ensure lead pipes don't pose a health hazard, easing winter parking restrictions in certain areas, and a plan by young people to keep other young people out of trouble. This is Council Rewind, and I'm Dustin Weiss. Restorative justice programs are a growing trend around the country, helping nonviolent offenders atone for what could otherwise be the first in a long series of bad decisions. Later in the program, how and why the Milwaukee Youth Council hopes to create such a program for other young people. But first, the dangers of lead in drinking water have been in the headlines for weeks following revelations about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. Most cities, including Milwaukee, have water mains, service lines, or fixtures that were made out of lead in a time before the dangers were understood. Through preventative measures, municipalities are able to keep that lead from getting into the water and posing a threat to kids and families. But what happens in the immediate aftermath of efforts to replace those old pipes with non-lead alternatives, and how are residents affected? The Steering and Rules Committee met on January 28th to find out.
The blue that you see is the water main in the street. It is connected by a service line that the city is responsible for that may be made of lead, and that goes up to a valve sort of in the grass, and that shut-off valve delineates the city-owned side, city maintenance side of the service from the private side of the service. So after that valve, underneath the front lawn, up to the basement and up into the water meter, is the service that is on the private side and is the responsibility of the homeowner to maintain that. Now, if your house was built before 1947, you definitely have a lead service line on both parts of that, all the way from the water main to the basement, unless you have independently replaced it. If your property was built between 1947 and 1951, you may or may not have lead. Both lead and copper were being installed then. But 1951 and later, you will have a copper service serving your house. There are possibilities that other fixtures in the house can contain lead. Faucets are notorious. Cheap faucets bought from faraway places are notorious for having a lot of lead in them, and that can get into the water. Some old piping used to be soldered with lead solder until 1996 when that was banned. But as in Milwaukee, that's a much smaller source of lead than the piping components can be. Of the 160,000 or so services that we have in our distribution system, about 70,000 of them are lead in the city of Milwaukee. Now that's a big number. It is not a surprising number given how the city grew and when the growth patterns came with when these materials were used in plumbing, but our communities, our neighboring communities, have lead service lines as well. Shorewood has about 95% of their service lines are lead. Chicago has about 80%, with almost 500,000 lead services in Chicago. Boston has 40,000. They stopped putting lead in the ground in the 1920s, and they almost immediately began taking it out. So they had many more than that, but their number is gradually decreasing. And there are cities, there's one community that is being held up as a model for replacing all of their lead service lines, and that's Madison. They had a 10-year project that finished about 5 years ago where they methodically went through their 8,000 lead service lines and replaced them. But one thing that is being known more and more is that when lead service lines are disturbed, that may cause an issue at the customer's tap. That has been shown to happen in other cities. So Milwaukee Water Works asked, is that something that could be happening in our system as well? And with these extra miles of water main, if it is, we should know that now before we start doing all of this water main work. So that is how we went down this path of trying to understand what was going in our distribution system. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. So what do we do? In 2015, Milwaukee Water Works, Milwaukee Health Department, the State Health Department and the US EPA sat down and devised a way to try to measure this impact of this construction. And what we did was we set up a pilot, and we asked customers who were living in homes with lead services in water main replacement projects if they would participate and collect samples from them. We asked 21 single-family properties if they would cooperate and help us out, and 6 of them agreed. So what those 6 properties did was they let the water rest in the pipes undisturbed overnight for 6 hours at least, and then they collected 12 sequential liters of water from their kitchen tap. And 12 liters of water in a home represents about 150 feet of pipe. So that would be the faucet, the kitchen tap, the basement plumbing, through the water meter, through the service, and well into the water main in the street for these properties. We collected those samples before any construction started in the street. We collected them again, or the customers collected them again, thank you customers, the day after that their water service had been connected to the new water main, and then we collected them again about a month later to see if any change had gone away. We found that in all 6 of those properties that the way that the lead looked in those 12 samples was different. There was no exact pattern of how the lead was scattered through those 12 samples before we started work, or if there even was lead. 5 of the 6 properties had some lead in some of those samples at low levels before we started the work. Every one of the 6 showed an impact at the customer's tap the day after the construction. Either there was more lead levels, the levels were higher in the samples that we collected, or more of those 12 bottles had lead in them than before. Okay, so now we've 24 hours after the construction, and then we go another month later, and the samples that were collected approximately a month later had all gone back down to the lead levels that were there before the construction started. So some amounts of lead naturally from the water resting in the pipes for 6 hours, an increase the day after the construction, the day after they were connected, and then a month later back down to whatever those levels were before we started. We organized up the results. We sat down again with Milwaukee Health Department, with the State Health Department, with the EPA, and with the Department of Natural Resources, and reviewed these results with them. And we were trying to learn from each other, should we proceed with these construction projects the way that we have always done them? Should we keep doing that going forward? Should we make some changes to our construction process? And the unanimous consent of everyone who was involved was that the absolute best, most responsible way to remove lead was to get rid of the entire service from the water meter all the way to the water main. And that was the ideal situation, and that interim solutions were going to have these negative effects almost no matter how we did them. So we've opted at this point to stop our water main replacements for 2016 that include lead services. We're going to keep going on the ones that have copper services while we regroup and try to understand what is the best thing that we can all do for public health.
So we do have something in place, and we are implementing a way of communicating that to those who would be affected by that type of construction and by those types of improvements, to ensure that they are able to do the practices that's necessary and protect themselves from the exposure. Right. And that's not happening. I mean, that's not creating a problem anywhere in the city either, where folks are experiencing these improvements, this infrastructure improvement, being exposed and not knowing. Right? So we're correcting that too, and we have a process in place to communicate that as well.
Yes, we physically are going to go to those homes. We're going to provide that information along with alternative methods for them to consume water while that construction is going on. So we are going to go to every home, and we're doing that. We did that during the pilot, and we offer options to those occupants there. And as was said earlier, not everyone accepts those options, but we have a statutory and a moral and a public health obligation to alert people to any concern or threat to their health.
We've had this discussion before. I've specifically raised this question, and I was always told just what you've been consistently saying. Well, between the chemical treatment and the natural buildup of minerals on the inside of a lead pipe, which creates sort of a barrier of minerals, a lead pipe undisturbed is probably not going to, water is probably not going to be very much affected, and your statistics pretty much say that. So our water has not all of a sudden gotten worse. There's not all of a sudden not been a huge spike in lead contamination. which you do have in other cities. And anyone who says, well, this is like Flint, is just outright irresponsible.
So the purpose of the infrastructure improvements of the water mains was for repair, not for purposes of reducing the lead levels, correct?
That's correct.
That's right.
Okay. So if we're going to make any noticeable difference, and we touched upon this before, we need to address the service line area.
Yes.
And
Yes.
what are you recommending, or what are you thinking right now would be the best way to approach that or tackle that issue?
That's in the planning stages, and that's why we have suspended that work for this year, to give us time to figure that out
We
with our
believe
partners.
there may be a short-term approach to this, allowing us to continue with our water main replacement and still deal with the construction period where the exposure is higher. But we don't believe that's the ultimate solution. Ideally, as you may have concluded already, that the ultimate and more ideal and long-term solution is to get rid of the entire length of that lead service.
Sounds like, well, there's the lead pipe there that seems to be okay until it's disturbed. That is leading to your home. And that you may well have, if you have galvanized pipe or lead solder inside the house, that at that point where it's disturbed, that might be a problem as well, and might be a source of lead. And I guess I'll ask Health Department, am I correct in what I just said?
We should talk about the other scenario, which is the day-to-day time when fresh water from the water main, you let that water run till it's cold, a little bit longer, so you will get lead-free water. But when the water does sit in those lead services for hours, 6 hours, for instance, then some lead will get leached from the pipe into the water. But it goes away if you flush it. And so the recommendation for people who do have lead service lines is, if it's been sitting for hours, run it for a couple of minutes before you use it for drinking or cooking.
But when you show me the charts, you're saying all of the lead exposure and people being tested, everything is decreasing, everything is safe. And they're not necessarily flushing. They're not, we're not replacing laterals. We're not, we're not doing that now. And so I still feel like the message that we're sending is that people are somehow exposed more now than they were a year ago or 2 years ago.
And that's important because nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. And the flushing it's a best practice. It's a recommendation. It's a way to
Reduce risk.
to reduce the risk. I mean, we can't minimize it maybe, but we can encourage people to reduce it. So those things haven't changed. And in fact, one of the 6 in the pilot study, the samples, the 12 that we got before, no detectable lead in any one of the 12, and they had a lead service. So it's not a guarantee, and every house will be different. It depends on water use. It depends on all things. It's a best practice to flush.
Obviously, this is going to be an ongoing issue. Perhaps maybe it'd be appropriate that we'll have a standing file for a quarterly basis, a report as to our efforts at both, obviously, a couple-phase approach, the intensive media campaign as it relates to this issue, but also on financing options, what we look at for the long-term solution to this problem, either state, federal, local resources, and incentives perhaps even being considered. But I think we have to explore all options.
Efforts to replace lead pipes have been suspended in Milwaukee until a long-term solution can be identified. With various rules in place to make it easier for plow drivers to clear snow, parking your car on Milwaukee's streets during the winter can be a tricky prospect. December 1st through March 1st, in most parts of the city, drivers are required to park on even or odd-numbered sides of the street depending on the calendar date. Parts of the east side, where parking is sparse, have been exempted from this requirement for a couple of years, unless there's a plowing operation going on. And on January 28th, the Public Safety Committee discussed an expansion to that exemption.
So, and if I guess I could explain the file briefly. This is a file we've discussed before, and this is an expansion that's been really demanded by a number of my constituents and constituents in Alderwoman Coggs and Alderman Bauman's district. But I also think it's an expansion, the way we've done it, that will be more palatable to this committee and to the Department of Public Works. So rather than have, the real goal of this was to allow people to park on both sides of the streets in exception areas. Normally, there's an exception to the exception in winter. So all from December 1st to March 1st, you have to alternate sides, no matter what, even if you're in an exception area the other 8 months of the year. And obviously, during snowfalls, that's necessary. When it's not snowing, which right now there is snow on the ground, but for most of December there wasn't, it doesn't make sense to not let them alternate like they do the other 8 months of the year. So this would make it essentially weather dependent rather than seasonal dependent. But rather than allow a blanket 5 days to park, which I know this city had concerns about abandoned cars, I've agreed at the Department of Public Works request to make it just a 2-day. So you're allowed to not move your car for 2 days, down from 5. And we've also expanded the area to include my entire district, the eastern portions of Alderman Coggs' district and northern portions of Alderman Bauman's district. Oh, and the other thing we've done, we've actually made it more restrictive when it does snow. So normally it's only from
2 a.m. to 6
2 to
a.m.
6, which is really only 4 hours in the day. In theory, that gets you the whole night if people go to bed at a reasonable hour, but that's in theory. In parts of the east side, people don't go to bed that early. So now that restriction, when we declare a snow plowing operation, it's from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. that we need one side clear one night, then the other side clear the other night. So it'll give the plows more opportunity to clear the parking lanes when it's snowing.
I know that the east side is a very unique area of the city. When we deal with these parking restrictions or expanding the parking restrictions, we do it pretty much based upon the alderman's testimony. But I think, if Alderman Kovac had mentioned to me that there were meetings on actually lifting these restrictions and the public was aware of the lifting of these restrictions, I probably would be in support of it. But because of this last recent snowfall and the lifting of restrictions and then instituting them back again, I don't want to start confusing people.
In theory, you can sign up for text messaging and know all this, but this is actually simpler than the 4-inch rule and all the other rules. Because if you see plows out and if you see snow on the ground, switch sides. If you don't. It's a lot simpler. So ultimately, I think this will I agree that right now it is a complicated stew of rules and signs. The ultimate goal of this rule, it's easy to understand. Now, if it's just one rule you put on top of all the other rules and don't change anything else, yes, it's confusing. But the real goal of this is to frankly start peeling back some of the other snow restrictions and just stick with this one.
So this lifts the requirement of, does it allow for parking on both sides of the street?
Unless it's snowing.
Anytime, unless it's snowing, yeah. Well.
Or unless there's a sign that restricts it otherwise.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. That's wonderful. But, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to vote against this at this time because it just covers this east side area and portions of other districts. I will tell you, if anyone cares to know the facts, there are more registered vehicles, which doesn't include unregistered vehicles, in the 53215 and the 53206 zip codes than in any other zip codes in the city of Milwaukee, which includes my area. And if what I'm calling for is let's get everyone together and review all of the parking restrictions overnight.
I don't see this legislation as prohibitive of any of us as representatives of the area that we represent who see a need for something similar to also be in place. For me, in the 8 years that I've been here, it's been a few streets that, because of the insistence of residents, of the lack of parking and issues, that I've had DPW look at and examine whether or not they could lift that requirement. In fact, I live on a street that we lifted the requirement for. So I don't see this legislation as prohibitive of that. In fact, more of us probably need to look at portions of our district where we might want to do this.
In retrospect, the Alderwoman raises a good point. I would like to, I will support this if this is amended to include the entire 8th Aldermanic District.
I have no objections.
We hadn't considered anything beyond this area, so I think that would be something that we could certainly look at is DPW, but this has been not only a look at parking regulations, but other regulations like street sweeping that I would like to discuss with operations, including sanitation staff and Preston Colin, the commissioner, to determine whether or not that would be included.
I think it's a great idea. We've been testing for a couple winters now, and I think that Alderman Donovan's area, given it's one of the other areas of the city that has this 8-month exception. I don't see why you shouldn't have a 12-month exception too. I've obviously been negotiating carefully with the Public Works and rolling this out slowly, so I don't want to speak for them. They obviously would like to go slowly with you too, but as far as I'm concerned, full speed ahead. I think it's a great idea. I think it could, but you do have to do, as Alderman Davis said, you've got to do some outreach to let people know what's going on.
The final legislation added parts of the 6th, the 4th, the 8th, the 12th, and the 14th, and the entire 3rd Aldermanic District to the exemption area. For more details, visit milwaukee.gov/MPW. The Milwaukee Youth Council is a group of 15 high school students that represent every part of the city and advise the Common Council on youth-related issues. They've recently championed the cause of a restorative justice initiative for young people. So on February 1st, the Community and Economic Development Committee heard their proposal.
This is a classic example of what we tried to do with the Youth Council. We had one member of the Youth Council, now it's President, Kaylin Haywood II, who came in and said, can we do a restorative justice initiative? And I said, I don't know, let's find out. And Andrew set off and began to do a lot of research. We discovered, and I discovered to my surprise, there's actually a national movement on this restorative justice program and its programming, and there's a lot of different models. We met with individuals from the police department, we met with individuals from the court system, we met with individuals from MPS. And the model that you have here in front of you and as part of this resolution, and it is only a proposal at this point, and I should stress this, but what we're proposing here, and it really was part of an idea that came from Captain Pierce from the Milwaukee Police Department, was that to take a very narrow set of schools, perhaps only one or two, and a very narrow set of offenses. We're not talking about violent offenders. We're not talking about people who are engaged in true criminality, but young people that are perhaps making their first wrong choice, and at a very young age. And Captain Pierce, and frankly, when we spoke to the judges, and I want to give particular credit both to Judge Mosley and Judge Chavez, who were very helpful in steering us, they said, frankly, there's a lot of young people that we have to work with, but frankly, if you can keep a ticket out of our system, we'd be grateful to you, if you can do it for the right thing. And so what this proposes is in that subset to get a hold of a young person in that school setting, and the police officer who is assigned would say, son or daughter, you can get this ticket, or you can enter this restorative justice process and try to understand what it is that brought you to this bad choice. If you go through this process, if you go through this evaluation, we will tear up the ticket. And as a result, you don't get a record, the police department doesn't have to track it, the courts don't have to track it, and hopefully we can intervene. And now this is, again, intended to be a very broad, and you'll see that in the resolution that's in front of you. It's intended to involve the police, the schools, the Community Development Block Grant Administration, and obviously the political side of things. And I really want to stress something here. This is not about creating light penalties for violent offenders. This is trying to get in at a very early point to young people who are making bad choices and trying to get them into something else that hopes to evaluate their background and their circumstance. It has very modest ambitions. And I've stressed that with the Youth Council, but hopefully from this, something very good could come and could eventually grow.
There'd be sort of 3 steps. The first would be a pre-conferencing session where the youth would meet with potentially an MPS social worker or someone else sort of channeling them into the system to make sure they understand their roles and responsibilities once they enter the system. And they can leave at any point, and as the city clerk had said, they'd probably be issued the citation or they would go into a more traditional process. The second step would be the mediation session of some sort. This would potentially work in conjunction with existing curriculum or existing ideas that are already in place in MPS, and part of choosing which schools these programs would be applied at would be focusing on curriculum that is already in place. So it's maybe not even necessarily recreating anything new here. The mediation session would involve a social worker, potentially a panel of peers. And when we had originally explored this idea with the Youth Council, the idea of a youth court had sort of been explored, and the idea here is perhaps to get away from that court idea, and as I said, it's more of a mediation session. It's not, you're not getting in front of your peers and receiving a judgment. You're there to talk about what happened and why it happened, and get into the ideas of restoration. And then the final process, or the final step, would be some sort of restorative action. It might be an educational session, it might be a skill building practice, it might be community service, writing a letter. But there would be that sort of sanction, but it wouldn't be a very heavy-handed attempt at punishing the student. It would be a way to offer that student an option, the ability to repair whatever harm that was done.
I think that that's wonderful, that that they want to get their feet wet and see if they can effectuate change, because that's very, very important. That said, okay, I guess a life lesson or a learning lesson is that not everybody's going to agree with it. Not everybody is going to say, oh, this is a wonderful thing. And I think that if they look to council members, at least this beloved council member, you could call me skeptical. And I say that because I am. And I would like to meet with the Youth Council to give them my points as far as why I am a doubting Thomas. But I also know that, in meeting with the judges at municipal court, that simple tickets, okay, be it for truancy or whatever, are not paid, okay, are not paid. To the point where municipal judges are saying, you know what, we're going to have to take the courtroom to the high schools. And I hear that and I said, what is this world coming to? Where is the sense of responsibility? Where is the responsibility? And you can say, yeah, it starts at home or whatever. But I have to tell you, gang, I consider this proposal very idealistic. Okay, I am very skeptical. And so what I'm saying, gentlemen, and what I'll be happy to say to the Youth Council are these points. And you know what? I hope I'm wrong. I hope that I'm wrong, and you can say, well, you were a doubting Thomas, and you were too skeptical, and you're always the guy whose glass is half empty. Well, prove me wrong then. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. And with that being said, as a chairman of this committee, Mr. Ozarski, can you schedule Alderman Bukowski to speak to the Youth Council at their next convening? Because I think it's important for them to have this dialogue. And this is what we do when we represent, is we have a supportive point of view, but we also have opposing point of view. And those young people who I know serve on the Youth Council would embrace that. The key thing is that we cannot afford to do nothing.
And who better to give us the advice and strategy than the actual youth? So the Youth Council needs to be commended, and I can tell they put their heart and soul and a lot of hard work into this. So I'm optimistic that this will go into the schools, go into the community, and be successful. And we are all here to help with this program and being successful and reaching to our youth. But I think the biggest component that needs to happen with all of the discussion regarding youth crime and youth misbehavior is the parent involvement piece.
The council voted 13-1 to advance the initiative. And that's a look back at some of the important issues from the most recent Common Council cycle. For the City Channel and Council Rewind, I'm Dustin Weiss.